Hello and welcome to this final video in my 10-part series on how organizations unwittingly burn out their employees. I'm Dr. Geri Puleo, the President and CEO of Change Management Solutions. And in today's final video, we're going to be discussing how the infamous work overload burns out workers. So let's talk about this idea of work overload. Often it's accompanied by employees saying, "Hey, who needs sleep?" Well, here's the problem. Work requires employees to expend energy. And the only way that workers can replenish that energy that they expend to do their jobs is through sleep. We are not robots. We cannot just plug into an electrical outlet at will. We need and crave restorative sleep. Now, the problem with work overload is when you have too much on your plate, is that you often have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. Now, this concept of work overload is often viewed as, well, it's just working long hours. But work overload has two specific dimensions. One, work overload occurs when employees are required to work long hours, significantly over the traditional 40 hours per week, over prolonged periods of time. So it's not just a short-term cyclical type of long work hours, but rather it's something that continues day in and day out so that the employee feels that there's no light at the end of the tunnel. Now, the second aspect of work overload occurs when the company makes significant changes to the employee's job scope. So in other words, there are major changes in the number of tasks, duties, and responsibilities for which they are now responsible for. In my own research on burnout during organizational change, I found that over 3/4 of my participants overall, or 78.6% specifically, felt that work overload, either through long work hours or significant changes in their job scope, specifically contributed to their demise into burnout. Now, this was consistent across demographics, so it didn't matter if the employee was male, female, a change leader, or a change target, or whether they worked for a non-profit or a for-profit organization. But what I found to be very interesting is that job creep in the job scope, so that the employee had more and more responsibilities heaped on their plate, contributed to burnout more when the employee was a change target or someone who was told to change but didn't have any voice in the change initiative. In fact, the rate of work overload burnout was double in change targets versus change leaders. So let's talk a little bit more about this connection between burnout and work overload. This graphic, once again, is the beginning stage of my BDOC model, or the Burnout During Organizational Change model, and you can find out more about it in video 1. But a quick recap is that most of my participants, in fact all of them, followed this downward trajectory when they burned out during the change initiative. They initially viewed their jobs in the organization with hope, but based on various organizational factors, which we've talked about in this 10-part series, that hope dissolved into frustration, anger, apathy, and eventually burnout. So when it comes to work overload, what were the specific organizational triggers? Well, the first thing would be longer work hours, as I mentioned before. Now, these longer work hours sometimes were mandatory, that the companies told employees, you simply cannot work a 40-hour week anymore. We need you to work more hours. We need you to work evenings, on weekends, or remotely. But it also includes changes in job scope. And these were formal demands. Whereas the longer work hours may have been mandated by the employer, sometimes the longer work hours were the employee's own decisions In other words, they felt that they had to put in more time in order to get the additional duties and responsibilities resulting from the enlargement of their jobs. So changes in job scope are definitely an area in which the organization has total control over. You can't just push that off on the worker and say, well, you contributed to this work overload. Now, when it's either longer work hours or changes in job scope, the work overload leads to serious problems in terms of solving problems and making decisions. Now, this is related to the fatigue because most employees can't unwind at night or they have difficulty sleeping. And when employees do not get restorative sleep that re-energizes them, they literally physically diminish the cognitive capabilities of their brains to solve problems effectively and make wise decisions. Well, all this causes employees to miss deadlines. And these missed deadlines, especially with star performers or those employees who really want to do a good job, leads them to become fearful, anxious, angry, and eventually they become apathetic when they believe that there is simply not enough time in the day to do everything that the employer is demanding of them. And so this loops back into creating an intense feeling of being overwhelmed and eventually disengaging from the organization. This is the apathy stage immediately preceding a full-blown physical and psychological burnout. And when this happens, the result to the organization is that its overall productivity and performance often rapidly deteriorate. And the workers who feel so overwhelmed by the amount of work that you're demanding from them eventually turn over. And if you've done any research or you have any experience in turnover, turnover is very costly to the organization, not only financially, but also in terms of overall morale. So the key to overcoming work overload is to focus more on work-life balance. Now, when we're talking work-life balance, this is not passing off this striving for a balanced perspective in terms of your job and your personal life. You can't push that off to the employees. What we're talking about here is to take formal actions in creating initiatives that enable and support and encourage employees to have a greater balance between their professional responsibilities and their personal responsibilities. There are several methods that an organization can use in order to help their employees regain that balance between their work and personal responsibilities. One of the most important reasons for prioritizing work projects for your entire workforce is the old adage that if everything is urgent, then nothing is urgent. Too often, this sense of urgency is overused by organizations, and the result is that employees don't fully understand what are the most important aspects of their job. So they need and they want direction on what they should be focusing on and where they should be expending their time and their energy. One of the most important ways to prioritize work projects is to create a chart which aligns the tactical duties or those daily activities conducted by your employees with the overarching strategic objectives of the organizations. Now, I found that a lot of companies have many projects in the works, but they don't fully understand why they're actually doing them. Well, if you can take your strategic objectives, then funnel them down into the operational goals, and then funnel those down even more deeply into the daily tactical duties that the individual employees are going to be doing, you can then answer the question of why this work is being undertaken. And when you have this unbroken alignment between the strategy, the operations, and the daily activities, it acts as a guiding star that helps employees better decide what they should be working on when. Now, as we all know, life is what happens when you're planning something else, and it's the same thing within an organization. In order to achieve that unbroken alignment, the organization needs to embrace flexibility. In other words, the organization has to determine how it's going to adapt to constantly changing environments and situations. In other words, the strategic goals should remain firm because you've done your research and these are the guiding stars or ultimate outcomes that you're trying to achieve. But the action plan or the daily activities and operations must be adaptable because quite honestly, things happen. And you may not have been able to predict certain things that happen that have changed the action plan that you're taking in order to achieve those goals. Also, you need to be willing to let go of any non-essential activities. In other words, many employees find that they have certain tasks or reports that they have to generate that basically go into the circular file or the garbage can, or nobody reads them, or the what it's trying to measure is outdated in terms of the plan to achieve the organization's strategic goals. But letting go of those non-essential activities can be frightening for many employees as well as managers. But when you're willing to let go of those non-essential activities, you can help employees and leaders determine what activities are helping them achieve the overall goals of the organization, or to determine that, you know something, these activities and projects are hindering our efforts to achieve our ultimate goals. And when you can have that kind of a guiding star or these priorities, it really helps employees decide where to spend their time and not waste it on activities that they have to do but aren't really that important. So the key takeaway here is that you need to focus the actions of your entire workforce on what's most important to achieving your strategic goals. And this will minimize a culture that is characterized by urgency and reactive responses to the constantly changing environment in which they're operating. And when you can remove that feeling of urgent reactivity within the culture, you will help to enhance employee morale as well as overall organizational performance. And then finally, you have to make time for a personal life. Now, this is something that I find really interesting. When it comes to employees' personal lives, many organizations say that is the responsibility of the individual worker. We have a hands-off approach. It's if they're burned out because of work overload or work-life imbalance, then it's their problem. Well, guess what? Burnout and work overload alike are not indicative of an employee's maladaptive response to stress. The organization has a responsibility, and they're going to achieve a better ROI and greater performance and overall quality if they encourage their employees to also have a life outside of work. So when we're talking about making time for a personal life, what I'm talking about and what I'm advising is for the organization to create formal actions, policies, and initiatives rather than passing this off to the employee. Because human beings have an innate need for rest and restoration. It's a human need. We can't escape it. We're not robots. One of the biggest red flags is when an employee is consistently working over 60 hours in a standard 5 to 7 day work week. Many companies view this as a badge of commitment or an indication that they are an engaged employee. But the reality is, when your workers are consistently working over 60 hours a week in order to just maintain what it is that they need to do, this is evidence that something is really wrong in terms of your strategic planning and your operations. Now, one of the ways to overcome this is to estimate the amount of time required for an employee or a department to complete the assigned tasks. Now, you have to ask if the project can be completed within a traditional 40-hour work week. It's very easy to say nobody works a 40-hour work week anymore and our employees routinely work 50 to 60 hours. But burnout affects cognitive capabilities within employees. And you need to give them time off to restore themselves and rejuvenate. So you have to ask, can it be done within a 40-hour work week? Or do we need to let go of certain non-essential activities? Or do we need to hire more workers to help ensure that these tasks get completed on time? Because again, burned out workers are going to take longer to complete tasks. The other thing is, I do realize that in certain types of cyclical businesses, there will be times when employees need to work longer than 40 hours a week. But if this is a temporary situation, it usually does not lead to burnout, providing that the employer provides time after this intense cycle of work for employees to take some time off and rest. And that leads to something else. Companies must formally encourage their employees to use their paid time off and their vacation time. According to a recent article and research by MarketWatch, only 54% of the total time off is actually used by employees. So in other words, employees are giving back to their employers half of the time that the employer is giving them. Now the question is, why? That's usually viewed as a decision by the employee not to take the time off. Well, here are some of the reasons why. And every one of them is based on fear. Some employees don't want to take the time off because they're afraid of getting behind on their work. That's about a third, according to the MarketWatch research. Many times it's because they believe that no one else in their company can do the work while they're out. That's about 30%. And again, if an employee feels that way, it might make them feel important, but the organization has to think about their succession planning. If, in fact, a single employee is the only one within your organization who can do that work, you don't have enough depth within your workforce. And then finally, some employees are just afraid because they're afraid that they just cannot disconnect from work, or else something bad will happen. So if you have employees who routinely work over 60 hours a week and don't take their time off that you're giving to them, these are two very, very important signs that your workplace culture is a culture of burnout. So the key takeaway here, remember that work-life balance enhances employee performance. We're not robots. We have certain characteristics and capabilities and competencies that artificial intelligence and robots cannot do. So let's start putting the human back in human resources. It will benefit your company enormously. So the final quote here is by Charles Reed. Sleep is life's nurse, sent from heaven to create us anew day by day. Work overload is never a good thing. You might think that you're getting greater productivity. You might think that you're getting more out of your employees, but eventually they're going to become exhausted, they're going to burn out, and they're going to leave your organization. So I want you to think about something. I've talked about 10 ways that organizations burn out their employees. Which one of these ways is indicative of your organization? It's about time to put the human back in human resources and reap the benefits of an engaged, committed workforce. Thanks again for watching this video series, and I look forward to seeing you on my YouTube channel at Dr. Geri Puleo. Good luck!